So we have sort of begun to explore a theme of exaltation. Big word. It really just means what it is that we hold sacred and why we do that. Why do we hold something sacred? Because what we exalt informs the world about the things that we truly value, those things that are closest to our hearts. And I will tell you that exaltation is not necessarily an active, conscious thing. Our actions speak more about what we hold dear than our words or explanations ever could. All someone has to do is look at your life, and they can get a really good picture of what it is that you value, that you hold sacred, those things that are most important to you. And really, one of the easiest ways to do that is to look at how you spend or withhold your money and what you choose to spend your time doing, where you put the most emphasis. Now, commitment is one of the surest measures of what a person exalts. I think that we can all agree that if we say that we hold something sacred, that we're really committed to it. We pour a lot of ourselves into it. We put work in, we invest time, energy, resources into it, and it shows. It really does. The fruit of our commitment might not actually show up immediately, like it might not be immediately apparent to people when they look at it. It might not even be evident a bit later, or even after a whole season of life, and possibly not even in the course of our lifetime. But when all is said and done, when we have exited this plane of existence, or maybe just a relationship, when people speak of us, they'll be able to easily identify the things that we were committed to because of their fruit. And they might even mock us for the things we might have said we were committed to, but never really had anything to show for it. Now, one of the things that really bothers me is that feeling you get when you're invested in something, but other people don't seem to be similarly invested. Like, it's this poisonous feeling. I'll give you an example of it. But it's like a poisonous feeling. It really eats at your soul. So here's one. You ever been stood up before? Okay. Thank you for the brave ones who let me know. Isn't that the worst? Oh my God. I'm not necessarily talking about romantic relationships either. I mean, it could be a friend, a spouse, maybe somebody you haven't seen in a while, and you discover, oh, okay, maybe they're not as committed to this relationship as I am, There's this internal realignment that happens to you, like, ooh, maybe I read this the wrong way, And shame often follows that feeling. You put yourself out there with all these hopes and dreams, and then reality hits you. So commitment is one of those things that really sets you apart from other people. A person who's committed to something is truly something noble, something that's looked at with admiration. And the deeper the commitment, the more the admiration. You might never want to do what they're doing. You might not be able to see how you could commit the kind of time that they do to that cause. But watching them try is truly inspiring. You find yourself wanting to be a part of that energy. Now, the lifestyle of a Jesus disciple was viewed in that way. If it had been undesirable, unattainable, Jesus wouldn't have had too many disciples, and we'd be getting a little more sleep on Sunday mornings, right? Instead, wherever Jesus went, he was followed by a crowd, very large crowds, as the gospel passage mentioned in its first line. Everybody wanted to see what was he going to do next? What amazing thing was he going to do? Was he going to lead a rebellion to overthrow the Romans, drive them out of the Holy Land? Was he going to have another faith healing? He was going to put hands on somebody and all of a sudden they'd walk, and they couldn't walk before, and now, oh my goodness, they're walking all over town. They're dancing. Did you hear how he feeds people at his talks? He just tells every old person to come on down. You don't even need a ticket, and there's this spread. Everybody gets what they want. But every so often, somebody would hear the message, and it would mess with them. It would move something deep inside of them, and they'd want to know more. But this was a new thing. Do you know what I mean by a new thing? I'll explain. So we hear all the time these days about how scheduled our lives have become. The people and the activities that you do each day, that you invest time in each day, that's where your energy's at. You have exalted those people, those things. Now, you might not always like them, right? But you make time for them. You pour resources into them. They mean something to you. So adding a new thing is tough. You might not feel like you've got it inside of you to add a new thing. Sometimes it's something that demands your attention, and you're like, you know what? I'm good. I don't have time for a new thing. But sometimes, something comes along, and it gets you thinking about, how can I shoehorn this new thing into my life? How can I make time for this? This is pretty amazing. I want to explore this a little bit more. Now, much of the time, you find you can't. But if it's really important to you, undeniable, really, you make time for it. You find a way. Well, I'll tell you what, though. You don't really make time for it. It's a new thing. You know what happens? It changes your life. You only have so many hours in the day. It changes your life. Something gets dropped, something gets added, something gets kind of readjusted, and this new thing finds its place. Now, the words of Jesus in our passage today really drive this home. On the first read, they might seem very harsh, as I explained to the kids. You want to become a disciple of Jesus? Hate your parents, your spouse, your children, your siblings, your own life. Hate them. Hate them for the time they rob from you. Hate them for how you've prioritized them. You wouldn't make time for people you hate. You wouldn't even give them the time of day, right? Think of those relationships that way. Hate them that way. And then when you're ready, follow Jesus. Everything you are and everything you own gets invested in this thing, no one else. That is what it's going to take. I'll tell you what, that sounds kind of harsh to a lot of people. Me particularly, almost unattainable, unrealistic, too high a cost. Now, it's easy to get hung up on the words, but like so many traveling scholars in those days, this man used some pretty extreme examples and allegory to drive a point home to his audience. I invite you to listen to what he's saying. What's he really saying? He's saying that this is a whole new life, one that requires commitment, not just some new thing you got to find time for in your busy schedule. How stupid are you going to look trying this Jesus disciple thing? This is what he'd be saying to those folks that would gather around him. How stupid are you going to look trying to follow me around, sinking your time and resources into it, forsaking relationships for it? I don't have that kind of faith in me to leave my son behind to follow Jesus? I don't. How stupid are you going to look trying this Jesus disciple thing, sinking all you are into it, leaving everything behind only to lose your nerve halfway through and go back to your old life? You'd be a laughingstock. How would anyone take you seriously after something like that? You have literally wrecked your life. How could you expect to reclaim your old relationships, those people you abandoned in the name of Christ? The way discipleship was done back then is very different than the way that we do it today. I think that kind of goes without saying, actually. Today we do it in churches. Instead of Jesus sitting in a field somewhere just kind of talking to the masses, you sit and listen to someone talk to you like you're doing right now. There weren't any buildings for Jesus' followers to gather in. It wasn't even a legitimate religion. In fact, Jesus didn't really bother with buildings. His ministry was public, you know? Sometimes he'd be invited into a home or some other place to talk, and they'd have a meal together. They'd pick things apart. A lot of his ministry was performed in the context of a meal. Quite frankly, I think that's why we continue to do that in churches. There's something about eating together at a table that gets people receptive. Now, I've heard some folks say, well, you know what, maybe we should just go back to doing things that way, the way that Jesus did them. I think there's some grain of truth to that. I do. I also think it's kind of silly. See, Jesus did a lot of future telling in his ministry. He was talking about the future all the time. And we say, of course he did. He was God. He could see the future. Yeah, of course he did. And I do believe that he did. He knew that his followers would one day grow this movement into something greater than it started. He could see how his beliefs would be abused by corrupted hearts and wills and cause pain and suffering. Can you imagine? But not once did he say, by the way, everybody, don't bother with this church thing. Just keep doing it this way. No. He knew that the way discipleship would look after he was gone would be very different. That people would continue to exalt him, but not necessarily be able to go to him directly for everything. We'd kind of have to figure some of this stuff out on our own. And that is what discipleship in our day looks like. We're committed to Christ through our faith. We believe that Christ joins us in presence, and we ask for it in our worship. But there's no physical Jesus standing here looking at you, talking to you. I'm what you got right now, and I'm not the only one. There are plenty of other speakers in this congregation, some who might even be more gifted than me. But that's what we have right now. We exalt Christ not by sitting before Christ and listening to Christ. We do it through our life as a church. Our life together exalts the Holy One. I would like to speak with you frankly about your church today, this congregation, just so we're clear. Now, the church council didn't know I was going to do this. In fact, no one in leadership knew what I planned to speak about today, but they do know the facts. I have done what I can to communicate the facts to them. Many have been asking about our financial future. I can say, 14 months into the job now, that the single most communicated message to me regarding our finances has been fear. Fear that the church is going to close. Fear that things are going to change in a way that isn't welcoming to newcomers. Fear that our past is being forgotten. I have never heard so much fear in a church in my ministry. But don't take that too seriously, because my ministry has not been that long. But I tell you folks, I have not always been a pastor. I was a layperson first, for 32 years of my life. And I have never experienced such fear. This church has been through it. Now, if you're new, you might not have known that. But if you ever should decide to join our fearless leadership team, you will undoubtedly hear all about it. The place that we are as a church did not happen overnight, but over many years. Somewhere along the line, things began to take a turn. And many wonderful relationships were broken. The spaces that you see in the pews before you were once filled by people that many here remain in contact with outside of this church. I can only imagine the pain that those who have stayed carry with them each and every day, and particularly on Sunday, as they remember days gone by. Believe me when I say, I know that pain. I've been in 4 churches that have closed, 4 of them. None as a pastor. I just thought that would be important for you to know. But these spaces that you see in front of you, they don't belong to those who are gone. They don't. You see, if they belong to those who have gone, they would become memorials to them. This is not a cemetery. In Christ's church, we believe in resurrection. There's a reason why that cross remains empty. These spaces are seats that await a new generation of Christians. The Holy Spirit is holding a space next to you right now for somebody that you haven't even met yet. Praise be to God. Praise be to God. A new friend in Christ that awaits your witness. Now, I have disseminated my recommendations as the senior leader of this house of prayer to our church council. As some of you might recall, we voted as a congregation regarding the usage of our endowment fund for operational expenses, should we need to, because at the beginning of the calendar year, we were facing a budget deficit of nearly $64,000. I'm proud to say that, as of today, we haven't touched those savings because of your generosity with your money and your time to cover some of our staffing requirements. So that money's intact. But we all acknowledge that in order to be a fruitful church, we have to invest in our ministry. I have projected a budget deficit of just under $50,000 by the end of June 2020. In simple terms, this means that at our current rate of revenue, we will have no choice but to use a little less than half of our endowment by the end of June 2020. This also means that you will no longer be able to afford a full-time pastor beyond that date. Now, the budget that I've offered to the council is bare bones. It doesn't include money allocated to staff a music director. We've been out without one for a while now. A custodian, again, without one for a while now, or an office assistant, without increasing the deficit number I mentioned, just under $50,000. However, we do understand how each of those positions, how much each of those positions would cost us. And this church will have to decide either now or after June 2020 how best to fund those positions. To do so now would expend the remainder of your invested savings. After June 2020, the change to a part-time status would still not provide enough revenue to allow for these positions without expending the invested funds. This Wednesday at 7 p.m., we're going to be holding a church council meeting to go over the business of the church. And these meetings, as I mentioned at the beginning of the service, are open to every single person in this congregation. I cannot encourage you enough to come to these meetings so you might get a stronger idea of how this church runs and to watch some of our great leaders do their work. I cannot praise them enough for what they do, making these good things happen when it can be so tempting to just live in fear. Let somebody else do it. And they will have to make a choice about the best path forward, whether it be the options I've presented to them or a different one. Friends, I'm speaking in particular to those who have been around the longest in this congregation. I'd like you to prayerfully consider the cost of what it would take to bring new life into this space. Consider your part in that work. What is the way that you can contribute to that? What is it about this place that keeps you coming back? What would it mean for all of that to change? Would it still be worth doing? Does your idea of what this place should be align with what God is calling it to be? And above all, just pray. Pray without ceasing. Pray for discernment about the part that you will play in the future of this church. I truly believe, and I told you my past with dying churches for a reason. I truly believe that the most prosperous days of this church are ahead of it. Now that might sound like wishful thinking to some. Not to me. I might not be a part of those days, but in the 14 months that I've been with you, I can say that I am so proud, so immensely proud to be a part of a church like this one. I am so proud to be your pastor. And I hope that our commitment to the cause of Christ in this place will bear fruit that future generations will speak of after we're long gone, and maybe even after our names have been forgotten, but not our legacies. Praise be to God, and amen.